Just to inform everybody, there's going to be direct translation in Spanish for those that need the... Okay, well, I will ask Juan to explain this.
Bueno, en español, los que necesitan una traducción en español, o sea, del inglés al español, pueden recogerse un receiver en acá, en la esquina. Gracias.
Thank you. Well, greetings, everybody, and welcome to this interactive session on setting a race to the top, guiding principles to rights-based approaches to sustainable landscapes. My name is Alain Fréchette, and I'm Director of Strategic Analysis and Global Engagement at the Rights and Resources Initiative, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this exciting panel this afternoon. As most of you know, there's growing interest in action to restore and conserve the world's lands, forest, freshwater, and coastal systems. Likewise, there's growing demand and pressure to develop these areas. Within this rapidly evolving context, the need to recognize and respect the distinct and differentiated rights of Indigenous peoples, local communities, and women who live in and depend on these areas has never been greater. To address these challenges, a wide range of social, environmental, safeguards, frameworks, certification systems have been developed in recent years. While encouraging, these initiatives have largely been developed in an uncoordinated fashion, and to date, there's not a common list of principles that are applicable to all of these standards. This creates confusion and the risk of adoption of lower than best practice principles. With me today are leaders and practitioners who've thought a great deal about these issues and who are here to get their take on the current state of play, the gaps that need to be filled, and the opportunities and challenges for moving this agenda forward. So I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. I'd like to assure you that we did everything we could to ensure gender balance. But some last-minute changes prevented us from being able to get there. But nevertheless, our panelists will do a good job of filling the gap. First, I'd like to introduce you Joan Carling. She's a co-convener of Indigenous Peoples Majors Group for the Sustainable Development Goals. James Whitehead, who's Director of Forest Peoples Program. Johannes Refisch, who's coordinator of the Great Apes Survival Partnership within the UN Environment Program. Mr. Juan Chang, who's Principal Forest and Land Use Specialist at the Green Climate Fund. And finally, last but not least, Mr. Kim Carstensen, who is Director General of Forest Stewardship Council. So, Joan, I'd like to start with you. IPMG has been on the forefront of global efforts to uphold and secure the rights of Indigenous peoples and women. Can you, what are we trying to accomplish with these principles that we're coming up with? Why is this important for IPMG? And what is the process for getting us there?
Hello? Can you hear me? All right. Good afternoon. I think it's already clear from the sessions this morning up to this afternoon that a lot of Indigenous peoples, from women to youth and elders, were speaking about why rights is important for Indigenous peoples and the kind of challenges that they face. That's one side. The other side is that Indigenous peoples are the stewards. They are the ones effectively protecting and managing the resources of the world that is sustainable. So now, why is a gold standard important on in relation to rights? What is clear at this stage is that while there are already existing international human rights instruments respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples, to some extent local communities, and also women, a lot of existing environmental standards, if I may say, are not fully in line with these existing international human rights standards. So it's more to put that as the highest level, because that will really set how we can have genuine partnership and changing the narrative that Indigenous peoples are not just victims, that we can actually partner with Indigenous peoples and learn from our traditional knowledge, learn from our sustainable resource management, learn from how we protect biodiversity, learn how, what are the values that we carry in order as peoples, as group of peoples, to protect the environment, protect our resources. And if we come to a partnership like that, I mean, it's only possible to come to a partnership like that if we agree that we respect and protect Indigenous people's rights as the starting point. So that is where we want to move forward with, that this is, we have the opportunity now, because we're losing the resources of the world, right? And Indigenous peoples are ready. We have always been ready, and we have always been persistent in the way we are defending and protecting the natural environment. But we need security of our rights to be able to do that. We need partnerships with you to be able to do that. But that partnership should be respectful of each other, respectful of not only our rights, but also that the acknowledgement that we actually also have the knowledge on how we can move forward, how we can, say, face the global crisis now of climate change, and at the same time also contribute in achieving sustainable development for all. So that's where we are. That's where we're aiming to go, that we agree to that kind of a standard where we can be engaging constructively, have the political will, have the good faith, have, you know, and it's possible. It's possible to have that if only we agree that rights-based approach is the step forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joan. So genuine partnerships and making Indigenous peoples, local communities, and women part of the solution is what I heard come out very clearly from your presentation. I'd like to invite Johannes. UNEP plays a huge role in setting the global environmental agenda. And I understand that UN Environment is currently revising its environmental, social, and economic sustainability framework. Why are these important for UNEP, and how do these standards link to your work in the field?
Yeah, many thanks for inviting me to the panel. I think I have to admit that I'm responsible for really destroying the gender balance, because I'm stepping in for my colleague Ziham Drisi, who was not able to come. But I also shouldn't joke too much, because I understand there's a yellow and a red card, so I better respect the rules of the panel. So yeah, human rights are at the core of the UN mandate, and I mentioned that in the morning session. And it's true, we are in the process of revising our safeguard framework, and I've been involved in the review of the biodiversity framework. But I think there are some practical implications that are quite important for our work. So as you said before, I'm coordinating Great Ape Survival Partnership. We have 23 countries in Africa and Asia. And as you know, both in Africa and Asia, the world is changing dramatically. Especially in Africa, we have never seen that rate of change before. Huge development projects have happened, and there are even bigger ones to come. And UNEP has been asked, and GRAS specifically, in a number of countries to assist the governments in facilitating a dialogue on cross-sectoral land use planning. And if we do that, we want to do it right, and we have to do it right. So first we have to obviously adhere to the UN principles, but also I think we want to do it right and want to do it better. So I've been personally involved in a number of land use planning processes in Central and West Africa, And we have been working very closely with the IUCN Commission on environmental, economic, and social policy. And when we actually developed a large-scale land use plan for the Mayombe region, which is shared by the two Congos, Angola and Gabon, we used the commission to review the draft plan and to validate it and make sure that the rights of indigenous and local people are respected. And I must say it was great, and I also learned a lot because I'm a trained ecologist. So why do we need this gold standard? Where can it help? I worked with IUCN and found it very helpful. There are other organizations, and some you see here on the panel, who have been working intensively on policy guidelines. I think it would help us all if the international community could agree on a set of golden standard best practice guidelines. So basically, when we do a project in the future and we use proper procedures, any donor, any partner can basically assume we have done it properly. And there are far-reaching discussions. Let's say you want to develop a landscape and you want to bring benefits to the local people, and we always believe the people who live with wildlife and the forest should also see the economic benefits. But who has the right to sell carbon? It's not that easy. So you open a much larger discussion. Who owns the land? And what happens if you don't get a land title because the government doesn't want to give you a title? Can you still sell the carbon credits? How do you ensure that the local communities can benefit? So it's actually even more than just having a golden standard. We also need to find a way how to apply it. So I avoid the red card. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Johannes. So I'd like to ask Kim, who's been involved heavily with the Forest Stewardship Council. So you've been working on this to develop 10 principles for sustainable forest management. Can you tell us more about them, what you've learned, what has been their impact, and would you also be able to inform us on the main challenges to changing business practices? What have you encountered in your work?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for the invitation to come here. I really like this kind of trying to get different actors to come together to agree sort of on a common platform. And I, of course, love the idea of racing to the top rather than racing to the bottom, which we see very often. Respect for Indigenous people's rights has been part of FSC since the very beginning. It's been part of our principles and criteria. We have 10 of the principles. Principle 3 is about the respect for Indigenous people's rights. It spells them out in quite some detail. Principle 4 is about the respect for local communities' rights. So that aspect is also covered in our standards. And what I think is important to note is also that one thing is the global principles. Another thing is how they get translated into national standards. And that translation into national standard gives, of course, a bit more on-the-ground feeling of reality in different countries. And in some countries, this is a huge issue. Give an example, we just have a new standard approved for Canada. In Canada, we have not the normal 3 chambers that we operate with: economic, social, and environmental. In Canada, we have 4 chambers, so we also have an Indigenous Peoples Chamber who have as much influence and as much part of the decision-making as any of the other chambers. And in Canada, in the new standard, the spelling out of Indigenous rights and what does FPIC mean in a context where Indigenous peoples are part of setting the standard has been spelled out in more detail than you will find in certain other standards in our system. So we do have some front runners, which is also interesting for us as a system. But that translation into national standards is obviously very, very important. Some of this is difficult because of lack of knowledge, because of lack of tradition. I mean, we have a huge discussion. I said Canada, they're doing really well, I think, on FPIC. It's coming up as a huge issue. It's also part of the political debate. In Russia, I mean, we're really struggling to get acceptance of the concept of free, prior, and informed consent among certificate holders in Russia because it's new and it's foreign to them and they don't understand where it comes from. And I think for places like that, a set of international principles that we could refer to, I think could be really helpful as an example. Why doesn't this just happen? Well, I said lack of knowledge is one thing, but I would say there are also other issues. I mean, this is about power, it's about resources, so it's not going to be just a walk in the park to get these things. They are really tough and difficult, and there will be conflict around them. But I mean, we need to be there, and having some principles to start the conflict with, I think, is going to be helpful in that setting. What we will be doing with this, I think, is we have internally in FSC a permanent Indigenous Peoples Committee consisting of Indigenous people who advise our board on issues of relevance to Indigenous people. They will meet here in Bonn in a few weeks, and I think we will bring these principles to them to see what is their reaction to them and how could they see us engage in a follow-up discussion on how to make these real and how could we work together with other partners on making this happen.
Great, thank you. So real challenges in terms of getting countries, both Johannes and Kim, you've both referred to working with countries to get them to agree to that would be a challenge in its own right. James, FPP has been active in the steering group of the accountability framework, which has been developed to help companies deliver on ethical supply chain commitments. Can you briefly explain what AFI is, and can you share some of the lessons learned from that process?
Yeah. So when people ask what's the Accountability Framework Initiative, I respond by saying it's a meta-standard. And people will generally nod and pretend that they also understand what that means. And I have also nodded before that and pretended that I know what it means. So it's not a standard, it's a meta-standard. So I'll come to that in a second. What it really is, it's a response to companies who said, there are all these standards, all these definitions out there, we're getting confused. There's all these certification schemes. We need some clarity. We've made commitments as companies around zero deforestation and respect of human rights within our supply chains. So we're talking downstream and upstream actors. And we kind of need to know from you guys what that means. Can you get your heads together and just be a little bit clearer? And so that's what the Accountability Framework Initiative is striving to do. And so have come up with some norms, some definitions, and some guidelines around those key areas around if you're serious about zero deforestation and respect for human rights in your supply chains, then take a look at this and follow it through. So an example would be that, well, there are 12 principles, and I'll just give you a couple. Respect for human rights is one which I'll naturally pick. And if you then drill down into that, it says, well, you've got respect for workers, okay, good, and you've got respect for Indigenous people and local communities. Okay, and you drill down into that, and it gives you some more definitions, and it gives you some more guidance on areas like free, prior, and informed consent, and what is expected, and what are the norms, and what are some of the guidelines around those areas. And it'll do the same on other principles, and you can find them on the website, dead easy, Accountability Framework, stick it into Google. So land management and long-term protection, or monitoring and verification. What does that mean? So you make a commitment, yeah, we'll monitor and verify. Okay, let's drill down and see what does that mean in practice. So it's about being pragmatic. And this has been done as a consortium of organizations, including Verite, the Nature Conservancy, Rainforest Alliance, WWF, Forest Peoples Program, WRI, and some others. And I think there's three things which I wanted to bring in, which is it's about establishing, implementing, and demonstrating your commitments. So it's those three things, and I think that might be something which comes back as relevant as we come back into the discussions.
Thank you very much.
Alan.
So the need for practical step-by-step tool that can support implementation is what I took away from this. Juan, the Green Climate Fund has recently adopted an IP policy, and congratulations, it is the first of its kind. And also, you use and rely the IFC standards, International Finance Corporation standards, safeguards, sorry. How are these two instruments linked, and what has been your experience to date with the application of these tools?
Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for everyone coming here. I want to make a disclaimer first. I'm not an expert in safeguards. Actually, my expertise and my role at the GCF is look at the implementation of the projects or operationalizing the projects, and we have an expert team of colleagues who are looking into the safeguards and the Indigenous People policy. But I can make a few comments based on the experience that I have when looking at the forest projects that we receive in relation to these performance standards. Well, first of all, the Indigenous People policy makes reference to the Performance Standard 7 of the IFC. And just to keep in mind that this has been approved by the board as an interim policy. So the expectation is that the GCF will have its own environmental and social safeguard standards at some point. Okay? So for now, we're using as an interim the IFC performance standards. And at some point, it may evolve, including more evolved safeguards, and eventually taking into account these developments that you are presenting today. These principles are very important, and I was reading them with a lot of attention. Now, some challenges that we see is that the IFC standards are, in my understanding, are set more for project activity level interventions. Now, what we see in the development, and let me now go to my area of expertise, which is more forest REDD+ related activities, which I believe many of you are very well aware of. It has its own set of standards, for example, the Cancun safeguards. But these are expected to implement at the national level or at subnational levels, not at activity level. And now we're finding these, let's say, new challenges. How can we move from project level or activity level implementation of safeguards to country level or to subnational level scales, where eventually you may need another set of monitoring process or making sure that of the compliance with these safeguards at different scales now and at different processes. You cannot make an aggregation of safeguards application project by project basis at the national level, right? Another element that we found is the compilation or keeping the record of the application of the safeguards. Now that we're looking at the REDD+ results-based payments pilot that the GCF has approved, our requirement is to demonstrate that safeguards were applied in accordance to Cancun standards and countries' policies. But it's hard for countries to get the record that they did apply those safeguards, that they can demonstrate that they were implemented. No? And probably that's something that not necessarily is part of a principle, but it's a matter of transparency as well. And by the way, I'm not sure, I couldn't find that in this part, but I probably missed. But having a transparency process, and it's in relation to the implementation, to the demonstration that James was making a reference, I believe, to demonstrate that the safeguards are implemented, there needs to be a transparent process and ways to show that. No? Let me stop here, and I can complement more.
Thank you, Juan. So some definitive operational challenges, as well as the need for transparent process for demonstrating that these principles are being applied. I'd like to open up the discussion to the audience and invite, if there are questions to our panelists, before we go to discussing more what we mean by the gold standards, just to get a basic understanding. Are there questions that emerge that you'd like to ask to our panelists? Yeah, she says we have a shy audience here. Yes. Oh, please.
Hi. My question may be very premature, but I'm wondering about the practicality of coming to this gold standard and how the space to discuss it can be created to include as many different people and as different stakeholders as possible. my particular background is from working very, very directly with Indigenous communities, so I have seen how difficult it is for them to get involved in these kind of discussions, and the gap that exists from that level to people here in the conference discussing the issues that we're raising. So I just wanted to know more about the practicality of opening those discussions up and how to get really an equitable base for the discussions towards the gold standard.
Thank you. Do we have another question or two? Well, perhaps we can take that and then invite Joan to walk us. Oh, we have another one here. Thanks.
I'd like just to build on that comment by, I think Joan really talked about partnerships, whereas the other approach seems to be, I mean, FPIC, respect for Indigenous rights, all talk about an acknowledgement of rights, but not a partnership. I think they're different, and I think the comment about the need to develop standards with Indigenous people in partnership is perhaps a different approach, so I'd like to see if there's a way forward there.
Thank you. So maybe we can answer that question. Kim, so how do we develop effective partnerships with Indigenous peoples and local communities and women?
I'm not sure I can completely answer that question, but what I wanted to reflect on was this idea of how do we get this discussed and discussed among Indigenous people outside of this room. And one thing I could at least offer and say we would be interested in engaging. As I mentioned, we have this permanent Indigenous Peoples'committee who will be meeting in a few weeks. We are planning, as part of sort of their operations, to have regional Indigenous peoples meetings over the next couple of years. We'll have one in the US for North America in September. We'll have one for Latin America. It'll be in Panama in November. If anybody would be interested in engaging with that, we will be inviting Indigenous peoples that we know and that work with us. But if others were interested in engaging in that, we could probably make this and the principles a discussion topic in those settings and get some feedback from these groups. We would normally expect 40, 50 people from Indigenous groups from the region we're talking about. It could be more, of course, but then somebody else would need to sort of join in and pay some of the cost, etc. But we'd be happy to engage in an initiative like that.
Thank you. James, Johannes, Juan, any thoughts about how to effectively engage partnership?
Okay. Yeah, maybe I want to respond first on the question on the practicality and the gaps. That's right, that there's a huge gap between existing international instruments or safeguards and the level of understanding and its implementation at the community level, I mean, understanding of communities. I want to cite an example, though, on how this works. Like in a lot of Latin American countries where the convention, ILO Convention 169 on the rights of tribal and indigenous peoples, communities are using it almost like their Bible. And they're saying that this is our rights, you need to respect our rights. And that's the one that we want this to lead to. That while we don't expect that it will be, you know, people will immediately implement it or not, but it will provide tools for communities to also monitor and review and assess how those players that are coming into their community and affecting their landscapes are behaving, right? If they have say, hey, you're violating this principle, you're violating this, and if they are not violating, then that's a basis also for partnership. So it serves both purpose, and that's where I want to move to the second point, where the question was that the standards are not leading into partnerships, the safeguards, because the approach is safeguard, that is do no harm. So it's really, it's more like, okay, we will not do harm, but we will just go with what we want to do. What we want here is to go beyond do no harm, but to doing good and building partnerships. Because we can do this together. right? If we are both, we have the objective for sustainable landscapes, we have the objective for sustainable conservation, and agree on a set of principles, why can't we do it together, right? And that's what we're driving at, that recognize us as an actor. It's not just that, okay, you come and see, do you agree with this project? And then do your own thing. So that's the one that we want to lead this, that the gold standard that we're setting will hopefully lead to that kind of change of going beyond do no harm, but getting into partnership of working together at the ground level in realizing and the protection of our environment and upholding the integrity of nature. I hope I have responded.
Yes, quickly, Johannes.
Now, I haven't been personally involved in the development of the gold standard, but I think we have gained quite some experience in how to integrate indigenous peoples into planning processes, and maybe that's the strongest argument why to involve the UN. I think our convening power is very important, because usually all different stakeholder groups, including the indigenous people and the local communities, accept our neutrality. And I can give you many examples. One recent example was in Senegal. For years it was impossible to establish a dialogue between the government, 3 gold mining companies and local communities. It was impossible. They didn't even talk to each other. Not even different government departments were talking to each other. But of course, who were the people suffering from that? It was the local people, of course, because decisions were taken and they were not involved. So we were asked, and I was asked specifically to provide a platform, a neutral platform, and we got everybody to the table. So we do have some examples on how to structure these processes, how to govern this, because it's a long-term process and you need all stakeholder sectors there, and you need to, you cannot always meet with 200 people, so you need structures and a control mechanism and eventually even a grievance mechanism. So I think we do have some experience in doing this. And I believe if maybe one day we have a gold standard, it would help my work enormously, because I'm not necessarily an expert, but I would know when I facilitate those processes, I can refer to the gold standard and can make sure my projects are better. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe this is a good segue so that we move on to what exactly are those gold standards? So I'd like to invite Joan to walk us through some of the preliminary principles that have emerged from reflection. And can you explain to us what is it we're trying to achieve? We're not changing the world, so what are we doing that's different?
Yeah, just again to at the outset say that this is a very preliminary work. It's this set of principles came about when we reviewed the international human rights instruments as the lens to look into existing standards that are affecting landscapes. So, and so these are already based on existing international instruments that relates to landscapes. Just to reiterate that we're addressing here indigenous peoples, local communities, and women. So when we talk of the rights-based approach, we are taking into account the rights of these 3 marginalized groups, or that are seriously affected by unsustainable practices in, on landscapes. So, and also to mention that this set initial set of principles are also very much interrelated. It's not like they are separated, but because of we're looking at it as a more integral and a holistic approach as well on how rights can be recognized, with the vision of also establishing partnerships and working together. So the first one, I don't know whether I should read it through or what.
If you could just explain to us what's the basic outline
also,
of these.
So that I get to stand up. So the first one is in relation to rights. Emphasize, and of course it's a rights-based, but putting emphasis on the central role of respecting the rights to land, territories, and resources of indigenous peoples, right? And this is not in relation to whether they are legally recognized by states, but more on the practice of the customary control of indigenous peoples over their lands, territories, and resources. So that's one. That's a very central issue. Second is that all programs, projects, initiatives affecting the lands and territories of indigenous peoples, local communities, and when accurately identify, respect, and effectively, and like I said in the first one, if the land rights are not legally recognized, then there should be effort for the legal recognition or providing security over these lands, territories, and resources. Because securing land is critical when we're talking of landscapes, right? It will underpin sustainability. Also, it will underpin that indigenous peoples will be able to continue their cultural or customary practices in relation to lands and resources. So seeking land, ensuring security over the land is a critical element. The third point is taking into account also the self-determined development priorities of indigenous peoples. And that any kind of development intervention, now they call it sustainable development, should be fully aligned in respecting and ensuring the free, prior, and informed consent of communities. So it's underpinning, again, the issue of if an intervention is coming in, it has to have the consent of communities. And important, it's always, and this is not underlined in a lot of the what is called free, prior, and informed consent, the right to information, right? Because in so many cases, indigenous peoples are misinformed on the projects that is being implemented. Information is being manipulated so that people will give their consent. So I'm giving the right to information, accurate information, and information that communities understand as a basis for them to take a decision. They come together. That's a third. Now the next point. Okay, can you raise it? Who is controlling? Yes, can you raise number 4? Up, up, up. Are you? Okay. The fourth relates to also the issue of where are we? Fourth, yes, we're giving a specific reference to women in this context because we know that women are at the front line. They are the ones playing a critical role in sustainable landscapes and having also the knowledge. So we want to make sure that women also have their rights, their equal rights to land, territories, and resources is also respected and guaranteed. So that's another point that is in the context of the collective rights on lands, but also the individual rights of women is guaranteed. Next. Oh, there you are. So the fifth one is in relation to respecting customary laws, management systems, and traditional knowledge. Yeah, because this is a bundle. When we talk of land rights, it's actually a bundle, an integrated set of rights that comes with it. So this is highlighting the recognition of customary laws and sustainable management practices and traditional knowledge, okay? The sixth is in relation to cultural heritage. And quite a number of existing standards don't actually refer to cultural heritage of indigenous peoples. And this means that, that when we talk of natural heritage, it is based on our perception, not in anyone's perception, because it's our culture. So, and that is again a matter of others talking of cultural heritage from their perspective, interpreting things from their own perspective. This time, we want to put cultural heritage from what is the perspective and the cultural values of the different elements, for example, of the landscapes to indigenous people. So it should be coming from our perspective, including the perspectives of women. Then we have, where is that second number? Where are we? 7? You're listening. That's a test. This again is taking into account the specific needs of women and youth, that we need to embed and make it as inclusive of the youth and women when we undertake projects in relation to sustainable landscapes, and them having also entitlement to what we call equitable sharing of benefits. That equitable sharing of benefits should also be inclusive of women and youth. Yeah. Then 8, this is in relation to grievance mechanism or redress mechanism. That as a part of showing goodwill and political will is also the need that in case there's something wrong happens, we're ready to address that. We're ready to provide solution. So that should also be embedded, right? That there is an effective access to grievances. All right? You're still with me? Okay, 9. Is that the last? Hello? Hello? Okay. That finally, that all the signatories to this gold standard undertake to promote their adoption by others, transparency in their implementation, and to assess and report on the effectiveness of their actions, including identifying in collaboration with indigenous peoples and other rights holders the extent of those rights. So finally, it's just that once because this is a voluntary, the gold standard is a voluntary instrument, right? But once you commit to this, you also commit to promote it so that it gets the implementation. Hopefully, will really become broader in that sense, and that the spirit of collaboration is embedded in any endorsement or adoption of this gold standard. So, just to mention, and you see, like for example, I can see from the FSC, from the UN resolution and other, there are, these are already there, but it's not put into one, it's not, it's reflected here also, those that are aligned to human rights in existing standards. They're actually already here, no? This is just to consolidate and bring it to the highest level as per existing human rights standards. So we're not reinventing the wheel. The other one that I want to say is we're not duplicating standards. We're just putting together the highest level that's possible, that can facilitate also not just do no harm, but partnerships. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Joan. A natural teacher, I see. I'd like to open up the conversation for questions from the audience, but first I would like to ask our panelists first impressions on these. What do you see as being unique about this set of principles, and what gaps do you see that it's going to fill or help fill in your own work and initiatives that you're currently leading? Please, James.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's some areas of of similarity in terms of the Accountability Framework Initiative, in terms of what should good look like, what's acceptable, and what is rooted in human rights law. But there's also something in here which goes beyond. So when I look at this, I see two things which are mixed into these standards. One is this, Joan, as you said, the do no harm. This area of at a minimum, this is what is expected. And that's around, for example, consultation. So those things are really important. And so that in the gold standard, that's the stainless steel. I brought a spoon just to demonstrate, so we know what stainless steel is. That's stainless steel. That there is something, it's really important to restate what are the commitments of every actor under human rights law. Whoever you are, wherever you are, whether the state you're working with respects those rights or not, you as an organization have to. So that is really important, and it's worth restating the at a minimum, do no harm. But there's something really precious in there, more precious than stainless steel, which is
the golden spoon.
Gold. The gold, which is, so there's a sort of, if you're not with us, you're against us, if you're, that piece. So there's one saying, is the do no harm. But then what's the do good? I want to ask organizations, what have you done to advance land rights for Indigenous peoples in your program? What have you done to strengthen the visions of Indigenous communities and their vision for their territory in your work? The gold is in there as well. It's those things about going beyond, not just do no harm, but actually be part of a solution for Indigenous people and the realization of rights. So it's words like affirm, advance, and strengthen. Those aren't in the Accountability Framework Initiative. The Accountability Framework Initiative is good old stainless steel. What's in here is stainless steel and the gold as well. And we have an expectation of the change that we want to see. We need gold as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James. Any other thoughts from our panelists? Please, Kim.
I like that stainless steel and gold. I mean, we got all this stainless steel in our standards, so I think most of this is there already. But I think that shift in perspective is relevant in two ways. And it reminds me of one thing at least, which is that in our work with this Permanent Indigenous Peoples Committee that I referred to, from the very beginning, it was very much about making sure that they could uphold their rights, so that they could defend themselves against whatever developments others wanted to establish. But lately, the last couple of years, the discussion has moved more into how can they actually promote their own situation, their own businesses, their own use of the land that they have the rights to. And that's where I think it becomes really, really interesting. And insofar as this sort of framework can embrace both sets of situations, I think that makes it even more interesting and relevant. This for us at the moment is theory. I mean, it happens, it exists in different places in the world that Indigenous peoples have their own territories, have them certified, have businesses, and use the land in a way that they benefit from. We have examples in Canada and the US and some other places. But I'd love to see much more of that. So that's one. The other big thing I see here, which at least for us is a little bit different from how we have traditionally done business, is the grievance mechanism perspective. I mean, we've had a grievance, or have a grievance mechanism system, which is mainly aimed at making sure that we can control whether somebody deserves to have a certificate or not, right? And if they don't deserve to have a certificate, we kick them out. And in some ways, and in some cases, that's probably not actually the right thing to do. Because when you kick them out, you have no influence over them anymore, you have no way of working with them, and they just become sort of do whatever they want, right? And there's no control anymore. So One thing we're working on at the moment, and our board is very interested in that thinking, is how can we develop a grievance system that also looks at compensation and remedy as one thing that we want to ensure as part of it. And I mean, you could say at the moment our grievance system protects us, because it protects us from reputational damage that we might get if somebody misuses our logo. But it doesn't protect the people out there who may be sort of mistreated by somebody who has done something wrong in a certified operation. And how can we make that happen? That's going to be challenging, because it's going to not be easy to do it, etc. But if we sever the link with those people who actually have done harm, that we have no influence over them anymore. And that is something that we are at least working on, and I think this gives that kind of perspective, which I think is really interesting.
So the need for effective grievance mechanisms and tools and opportunities to foster locally led conservation and economic models, and also the golden ingredients that we just heard from James. Johannes, you wanted to point something out.
Yeah, I think I just would like to follow up on what Kim said, because it's very important. Obviously, related to my job, I look at it more from a conservation point of view, and it's absolutely right. Do not harm is good. It prevents us from a reputational risk, but it's not enough. And I think what we do in UNEP, and we actually have a framework program now on coexistence of people and wildlife. If we only do not harm, it's fine. So we don't have a risk, but we're not achieving our objectives. So, and this goes much, much beyond the gold standard. We actually need to implement it. And there's sometimes still surprising gaps in the legal system. And I'll give you an example. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it's quite recently, relatively recently, just a couple of years, that the government basically provided a provision in the law that communities can manage their own land and can also allocate land for conservation, and they can manage it, not the government, they can manage it. In the Republic of Congo, we try the same, and the government tolerates it, but there's no provision in the law. And I think these are very important things. We can go further. I think people can only coexist with wildlife if there are also economic benefits. I mean, people have to pay the health bills, the education bills, development bills, and so on. So they need to have some form of income. But if they cannot sell carbon credits because there's a gap in the law, there's a problem. How can we generate incentives for them so that they can survive but still conserve the wildlife and the nature which is surrounding them? So this is a big challenge for us, and I think a lot of more work is needed. And that goes beyond do not harm, and it goes beyond the golden standard, or the gold standard, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. So a key challenge of how do we get organizations to adopt these, and how do we get governments to endorse them and actually support these initiatives? So maybe there's questions that we should answer after. Did you want to make a comment? Please, Joan.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment that one of the target actually for this, for adoption of this gold standard are conservation organizations. Because there's a lot of conservation organizations, big and small, and they don't have a clear standard that is, I mean, the record is different, is, mixed, right? But if leading conservation organizations are going to adapt this in the spirit of partnership, I can already tell the difference it will make, because it's a change altogether on how you work with communities. It's a change altogether on how you treat the environment. We want to move from fortress conservation to conservation that respects people, that upholds the dignity of people, and that it's working together, in the spirit of working together, that we can actually conserve the remaining resources. Because a lot of organizations are still in that approach where it's not just do no harm, but it's like we take out the people so that we can conserve the environment, which is really the wrong way. And we want to show that this is the right way to go about conservation with this big, especially the big international conservation organization. I just want to mention that. And also, of course, that we hope that intergovernmental bodies are going to endorse this. We're hoping that at some point, even the GLF will fully endorse this and will encourage other players, but also the intergovernmental bodies, especially those working on environment, that if they endorse it, then that also helps us leverage those endorsements for governments to adopt. And I think it's more feasible also to work not just national governments, but local governments, right? So we shouldn't just be thinking of national governments, but in a lot of cases, it's actually local governments are more approachable, and they're the ones on the ground. And we hope that they will also take this as an opportunity to do things right.
Thank you, Joan. So lots of, I guess, challenges in terms of shifting the paradigm to make Indigenous people, local communities, and women part of the solutions and effective partners in the whole enterprise. Johannes, I know you wanted to join in, but maybe we can ask for questions from the audience and then invite further reflections from the panel. So I see a hand raised in the back there. Sorry.
Thank you. My name is Leo van der Vlist. I'm also part of the board of FSC. So I can confirm what Kim just said. But I have a question, and that's actually a question that FSC is also struggling with, is how to define local communities, how to define the rights of local communities. Because for Indigenous peoples, we have long definitions and descriptions, but for local communities, we don't. For Indigenous peoples, we have the Declaration and we have the ILO Convention, but for local communities, we don't. So actually, in practice, when you go to the field, you get some very challenging situations, how to define those rights and who are exactly the rights holders. And now another category, women, may complicate it even more. As much as I respect the rights of women, let that be clear. But has there been some thinking about it in this group? I would like to learn from that. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'd like to take maybe a couple more, if possible, in the back. Chu in the back, please.
Good afternoon, Marlene Paiva from University of Liverpool. I wanted to ask, we have seen previously initiatives like the Global Compact principles, we have the UN guiding principles for on human rights obligations for corporations, for example, and all those previous initiatives are voluntarism based. So I would like to ask how these gold standard principles have an added value to these previous initiatives aside voluntarism. That is my question. I know that it's difficult because it's not, in principle, these are not legally binding rules, but what would be the added value to what we already have? Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was another question right there. Thanks.
Buenas tardes, yo soy Arlen Ribeira, indígena del pueblo Huitoto de la Amazonía del Perú, y solo quería expresar mi enorme preocupación en cuanto que no se está incluyendo a los pueblos indígenas en aislamiento voluntario y en contacto inicial. Debería, en alguna parte de algún texto, incluirse estos pueblos. Y yo pido aquí al ASCAI, al foro, que en los futuros eventos se hable sobre los pueblos indígenas en contacto inicial o en aislamiento, porque ellos son el último rezago que están viviendo en la profundidad de nuestras montañas. Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Can I ask our translator to?
Well, yeah, I will translate it directly, I think. My name is Alan Ribera. I'm from the Huitoto peoples from Peru, indigenous peoples, and I'm afraid a lot that there's nothing mentioned about the non-contacted or isolated indigenous peoples. I came here to the GLF and to the Substars, and there's no one from like initial contact or from the isolated people, and no one is talking about them. So this is, I'm caring a lot about this topic because no one is talking about them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So maybe I'll turn to our panelists. So the first question was how to define indigenous people communities, the different populations we're referring to. What's the added value of the gold standard relative to everything else that we have, and how do we ensure compliance application of this? And then how do we deal with an apparent absence of uncontacted people, and how can we address that? So maybe, Joan, you'd like to go first.
Yes, let me acknowledge the point made by our brother. I mean, we just completely missed that out, and I sincerely apologize that we should have included an element in respecting the position of those indigenous peoples, uncontacted indigenous peoples who wants to remain isolated or uncontacted. We will make sure that that will be added, and I really agree with you that we should put attention to this as well, that the threats to them are also going to be addressed. On the issue of local communities, you're right, that's an area where it's still like, who defines local communities? But it's a way that even the local communities and indigenous peoples facilitating platform within the UNFCCC is struggling with. But in the context of the gold standard that we're talking about, we're more referring to, because local communities is a bit generic, right? And what we mean, or what we qualify as local communities in this context, are those communities that have customary management practice of their lands, territories, and resources, and also those who have similar characteristics with indigenous peoples, but do not necessarily identify as indigenous peoples. So it's more the collectiveness and their continuing relations to their resources and for a long time, you know, the customary nature of it. So that's the local communities that we are referring to, and not just all local communities. So to quantify that will be put in the gold standard on what we are referring to as local communities. Let me also clarify that women, the reference to women here is the women within local communities and women within indigenous peoples, because we know and acknowledge that even within indigenous communities, there is existing inequality. There is the practice of patriarchy within indigenous communities, and we want to address that as well, to make sure that women, indigenous women, and women in local communities are given the voice, that they can equally participate, and their rights are also protected. So it's not women in general, but women in these two sectors. And the question on the guiding principles and the Equator Initiative, right? Those two standards were also reviewed, and some of the positive elements from there are incorporated here. So they were part of the standards that were reviewed. Of course, the UN guiding principles provides the framework, and that is clearly adapted here. But we just put more the ones that are relevant, particularly to the issue of landscapes, right? Because the UN guiding principles is general in terms of the application of human rights. But for example, the third pillar, which is on remedy, is what we are referring to here. The effective grievance mechanism is actually part of also of the UN guiding principles. The Equator Initiative, like I said, is more on the do no harm kind of policies, and that's important, but as everybody said, it's not enough, and those elements were also here. So those are bits and pieces that were taken in this. And finally, what's the added value? That's the question. The added value is the race to the top, that we're setting the highest level of a human rights-based approach to landscape management that goes beyond the do no harm.
Thank you, Joan. James, Juan, Kim, any thoughts on the challenges, how you've addressed those challenges within your own frameworks and tools? I see, Johannes, you wanted to, and we'll start with you, please.
It's maybe an indirect answer, but one of our main challenges indeed, how to deal with local communities and what defines local communities. And we have many situations in Africa where actually there are 90% are migrants from within the country, from outside the country, and maybe less than 10% of the indigenous people who actually have the customary rights, and how to deal with it. And there's conflict at all different levels between communities and local government, between communities and national government, regional policy, etc. I don't have a I mean, there's no silver bullet to solve it, but what we have done in the past is we have been working very closely with the International Institute for Sustainable Development and applied professional conflict resolution strategies. And we also use that same approach by dealing with national park authorities. You said that conservation should not become a fortress. And exactly that was a problem. So what we actually did is we chose people in the communities and trained them. And they serve as an interface between the parks and the community. Or we trained them to solve inter-community conflicts. And we did this because a lot of the actors in the conservation field don't have that background. They were never trained on conflict resolution. But we deal with conflicting interests on a daily basis. So that doesn't solve all problems, but I think on the technical and practical side is one way to apply systematic and professional conflict resolution strategies at the local level.
Joan, you wanted to quick note.
Just a quick note. Hello? Hello, just a quick note, that I just want to emphasize that going back to local communities, I just want to emphasize that we need to recognize that indigenous peoples and local communities have differentiated rights. Indigenous peoples have a set of collective rights that are already recognized by international law. And local communities, to some extent, also have a set of rights which is different or similar to indigenous peoples, but they are also have the individual rights as to all, applied to all, right? The reason why I'm explaining this is because it's now used commonly, indigenous peoples and local communities, as if we are the same. So I just want to make that emphasis that we are not the same, and we have a differentiated set of collective rights as indigenous peoples, just to set that record.
Thank you, Joan. Juan, you wanted to mention something quickly as well.
Yeah, very quick. On the challenges that I see is that, as Joan was mentioning, these ambitious principles try to get at the higher level, bringing many other different already established standards and others. So it's a challenge to get to that level. And then when you go to the implementation part, if we call it standards, and I'm sure IFC is more accurate in when we try to assure that these are implemented, probably you need more refined, and that's where the questions on definitions come from, I believe, right? You need probably more specific terminology, which doesn't coincide with the principle of the principles, which is a higher level principle, no? So the implementation may face those challenges. Another might be that how can we make this as a guiding pathways for certain institutions that probably do not have that experience. I can share that challenge, for example, from our value added, I would say. From the GCF side, how we operate is through accredited entities, through agencies. We don't execute the projects directly. We work with partners. There are 84 partners that range from local NGOs to multilateral banks. BIS? No, BIS are not their agencies. Multilateral banks, local NGOs, private banks. And when they became partners to GCF, they had to adjust or create new policies. Some of them are related to indigenous people's policy. They don't have or they didn't have much track record in applying free prior informed consent, for instance. So these principles may help in transitioning or improving their capacities in applying principle level, and then more specific standard safeguards when it comes to project-specific interventions.
Thank you for that clarification. I'll just give the word to Kim and then James.
So this was back to the question about, I mean, why would this be different from initiatives that have been tried before and that maybe didn't live up to the expectations? And I mean, what I see in this is one thing is that it sort of gets together a number of perspectives on one topic instead of trying to cover everything. And I think that's important. And I think not try to put everything into this. I would certainly advise to keep it lean and clear. 9 is already a lot. I mean, I saw an earlier version with 6, and I thought 9, well, maybe now going to 12 and 15, I'm not sure. But I mean, keep it lean, I think, is important. But then the other thing, I guess, is, I mean, this will all depend on the constituency behind this and on the engagement and consultation processes that will happen over the next period. And I think that's going to be crucially important. If the right people and enough of them feel that they own this and this will make a difference for them, then I think it can really become a success. And that, I think, could be the difference between this and a number of other initiatives we've seen in the past.
Good point. Thank you. James, you wanted to add something?
Yeah. In terms of the Do No Harm, I mean, Forest Peoples Programme has seen in so many different contexts how harm has been done in the name of climate change reduction situation, in the name of conservation, in the name of business and global supply chains. There's a lot of stainless steel which is needed, absolutely clear. But there's also, I'm going back to the gold. I just wonder about what percentage of, we know that there's evidence around indigenous peoples' land and carbon sequestration and preservation of wildlife, megafauna and more broadly as well. There's a huge amount of evidence on that, particularly when there is territorial management in place, where there's strong vision and leadership, and when people have land title. Someone's written something about that, right? And I want to ask how much money, which flows towards climate change and flows towards conserving species on this planet, goes to indigenous-led vision for territory. What percentage? Is it 10%? Surely, because that's a lot of land. Is it 20%? So if we're talking about a race to the top, we're talking about gold medals. At the moment, I'm thinking that we're more around bronze medals, that there's so little around that shift which is needed within those spheres that, great, do no harm, keep it stainless steel, excellent. There's stuff around on that, and we can justify that more strongly with human rights law and really basing it on that. But I really want to see some gold medals given out, and there's a hell of a lot more gold that can be given out at the moment.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much for that very crucial point. We have a bit more time for a few more questions, and I'd like to invite, I see some hands raising now.
Can I go? Hi, I'm Alex. I'm from the University of Wageningen. Thanks very much. The principles are inspiring, and it's nice in a conference where things tend to be quite vague to have concrete points to talk about, so I really appreciate it. I know we keep doing circles with regards to gold standard and stainless steel, but the strength about gold inherently has no value unless everybody applies a value to it. And unless everybody does it, then it's gold. And a spoon, at least you can use a spoon. We don't make spoons out of gold because you can't use them unless everybody agrees. And so I still, I don't know if I'm convinced that something can be successful if it's voluntary. I think it has to be mandatory, but maybe I can ask you to either give me more faith in a voluntary system, or maybe question you and see how could you actually make something like this mandatory.
Thank you. There was some other questions here, please.
Hi everyone, my name is Maartje de Graaf. I work at Tropenbos International. I'm very curious to hear how this process relates to the sort of global movement for the ICA concept, the territories of life, and how those two things are running in parallel or how they can strengthen each other. So I'm very curious to hear your ideas about that.
Thank you. Do we have another question before we turn to the panelists? Oh, yeah, just we have Kevin here in the back, and then we'll turn to the panelists.
Yeah, well, I was Kevin Curry from the Ford Foundation. I was quite inspired by the last comments from James, so I would be curious to hear what consideration has been given to including in the standard that conservation organizations should be providing financing for Indigenous peoples and local communities to implement their own territorial management plans, and to see that as a form of conservation. So it seems there could be a hook here for actually shifting some of that conservation finance into local communities and Indigenous peoples.
Thank you, Kevin. So we only have 5 minutes left, and so I'll ask the panelists to be brief. So we had one question on voluntary, mandatory, what's best? The role of ICCAs, anything we can think of in terms of how they relate to this? And a related question from Kevin in terms of conservation financing. Can we shift some of that money towards creating locally led conservation efforts? Juan. We'll start with Juan.
Very brief on finance, actually. I would worry not about the conservation finance. I worried about the finance that does not exist in general, not even for conservation. Actually, the available finance that we have to deal, and I come from the area of climate change specifically, it's very tiny compared to the needs that we have. And in particular, and therefore, that tiny portion needs to be split where there are needs, no? And how we tackle climate change by recognizing rights. But we're trying to share already a tiny portion of the cake. I think we need to think a bit beyond the finance, not only from conservation, but the other sources of finance, including domestic finance in the countries. In many cases, the problem is not lack of finance. In many cases, the problem is the existing finance that is creating the problem within the countries. So it's not necessarily filling a gap with other sources of funding.
Okay. Thank you. Johannes, you wanted to quickly respond.
I just wanted to cite the example that I think some projects deserve a gold medal. All the points James raised are correct, but I think there are some projects who are doing quite well. I want to cite one of our own examples. In the Republic of Congo, we contributed to a local guerrilla tourism project. It's the first guerrilla tourism project in entirely a community zone in Africa. It's also the first high-end tourism project in Central Africa. So not 20%, not 40, not 50, 100% go to the communities. They manage it, they decide how the money is used, it's their territory, and if I can expand a bit on this, it's not the lack of conservation finance, as you said. It's more, I think we have to be more creative how we apply it. And in that specific case, it was a quite innovative partnership of the private sector, investing the lodge, a foundation, buffering the financial risk because the private sector couldn't handle that all, the communities, and technical assistance from a number of partners, conservation development partners. Very innovative in my way, in my thinking. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Joan and James, some questions directed towards you, both of you, in terms of do we make this voluntary or mandatory, and how do we ensure that there is strong compliance and effective implementation? What are some of your thoughts on that?
I think it's useful to distinguish between what's non-negotiable and then what's aspirational. And I think if organizations were to report on how they were implementing the aspirational, I think that would be really helpful. So I'm not advocating for a sort of certification scheme, but if there's some work done on how to report in a way which is clear and transparent, easy to engage with, then I think that would be really helpful to show, is the shift happening, and the shift which really needs to happen.
Of course, the wish is to make this mandatory, right? If I'm, the president of the U.S., if I can replace Trump or replace the Secretary General, then I'm in the position to make it mandatory. I mean, just to say that it's voluntary in the sense that it's our initiative, and it's something that is not in the system that decides on mandatory things, right? So that's just to say that. But I think while of course we know that voluntary is coming from the partners, the thing that is also good with voluntary in a way is that it can facilitate develop that partnership in that sense, given the limitations that we are dealing, or the realities that we are dealing with. It doesn't weaken that just because it's voluntary makes it weaker. The fact is that there's no gold standard that exists. And that's the gap that we are filling in. And we hope that with a strong sense of ownership by communities, by indigenous peoples, that it will go a long way in that sense, because it's like our rights that we are claiming for it, right? And in this context, also on the mandatory, some elements are legally binding for states who have ratified certain conventions, because some of the elements here are clearly pulled out. Like I said, it's based on human rights instruments. So at that sense, we can make it, that's part of the obligation of states. But the UN system itself cannot even hold states to account, right? So that's the reality, unfortunately, that we're dealing with. But I want to show that it's one way of showing that there is something that is visionary, right? That there is something that people can look up to, that if only these things are going to happen, it will make the difference. And I will do my part to make that difference. And that's the kind of mindset that we want to change, that people will feel that they are contributing and they are taking part by implementing this gold standard, and that they're part of that change, they're part of that solution, and it's empowering also the communities that are doing it themselves. So the other one, I'm not familiar with the other. I don't know if you're referring to another group of the ICCAs. Is it the ICCAs? As I said, this is just a preliminary work. It's still going to go around, so to speak. We actually have to translate it in different languages. So that's just to set that this is based on what we've heard clearly, is that indigenous peoples are wanting to have their rights recognized and respected. And that's the one that we put there. So now it's time to put it back to say, does it reflect your aspirations? So that's the next step to making sure that the indigenous peoples, local communities are aware of this. It's an inclusive process. Anyone can give their comments, because this is a process that we are undertaking. And we believe that we can still improve and we can still enrich this from the feedback and comments given to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. And with that, I'd like to close the session and remind everybody what Joan just indicated, that this will be a consultative process, so from now until the end of the fall, there'll be lots of consultation engagement with various stakeholders to validate, review, ensure that these are optimal in terms of gold standards. There'll be a stock-taking moment occurring in Accra at the next GLF in Accra. And we hope to launch the definitive set of standards by the end of this year, hoping that we get good input and a short list, as Kim invited us to think about. So with that, I'd like to ask everybody to thank our panelists and the great session we just had.
No, I just want to announce that if you want some fact sheets on the environment right protection initiative of the UNEP, we have the UNEP staff here. If you want to get those, because those are, I think, for Indigenous peoples, it's an important information to know, because it talks about how they can support our work on land, on defending lands. Thank you.